Our Terry texted me from New York City to get a live. Where's the grass?
New York is great.
She's on Broadway. Yeah, but she's telling me about.
It's not New York.
We're gonna give it. I don't want to start early in case someone's. We got about 2 minutes. For everyone in the audience that's new to this, of course, so this is our second defense of the day. We do 2 per day for 11 days, and we'll have 15, 20 minutes presentation, followed by 15 to 20 minutes of a Q&A with questions will come from the panel, committee members, as well as the audience. So we'll have some time to discuss the topic. So. Well, we're going to give it right at 4. We're not going to start early. See, who's been to all the defenses? Blake, are you the only one? And you're impressive. You're impressive. If you keep telling me at least. I should have tabulated by tomorrow, and I'll share this with the PA community at some point. Everyone's sending me the length of the project. I think this is, on average, probably the longest projects in school history. So we had multiple projects that exceeded 100 pages this year, and this has been a stellar class to work with. Looking forward to graduation. And Lake, you're ready already for next year, right? Fatima, ready?
Yeah. Well, I'm getting a picture.
Okay, do it now.
Thank you. Just got a minute. Just got 1 minute. Oh. Thank you.
Again, welcome everyone. This is our 4th of 22 Senior Honors Thesis Defenses. Again, it's been a pleasure to work with Molly. And I will tell you, the projects sometimes get reformatted, and Molly's was one of those. We started off, we did some modifications and changes along the way, which can be difficult, but Molly took that challenge and ran with it and created a project that first, structurally, it changed, and I think it morphed into something much, much more impressive. And she's, again, stellar work ethic. It's a really, really exciting to work with her the last 2 years. And again, the best of 2023. You guys are awesome. It's been an awesome thesis class. I think this is going to be a really informative presentation, and I'll just give it up to Molly Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Toppich. As he said, I'm Molly Williams, and I'd like to thank you all for coming here today for my honors senior thesis project, Breaking the Cycle: Impacts and Solutions Relating to Juvenile Crime in America. I would like to begin with my literature review. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Statistical Briefing Book was incredibly helpful for me to have a starting point in my thesis project and develop opinions on my topic. It helped me lay out a pathway for my thesis as I learned just how important the juvenile justice issue was in America and how these statistics look in our own country. From this, I was able to determine how and why this issue is so important. Second, when I began researching the differences between race, gender, and socioeconomic status in criminal offenses, delinquent by reason of poverty, and the influence of gender and traumatic experiences on length of time served in juvenile justice settings, both were incredibly beneficial to my research, and they were the foundation of my disparities chapter. These sources were invaluable in helping me understand the gendered pathways of juvenile crime and just how important socioeconomic status is in juvenile offending. And finally, Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson showed me how big of a passion I would end up having for this project. I was actually able to use one of his stories as a case study in my own thesis, and it truly ignited a passion within me for my research. When I moved to the policy recommendations section of my thesis, these 2 sources were very helpful to me. Crime Solutions and Strengthen and Mobilizing Communities are both from the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Justice Programs, and they allow me to access all the model programs that I would use to explain my policy recommendations and how those can be exemplified well in the United States. To begin, crime among adolescents is unfortunately an issue that has moved away from the forefront of American focus despite its continuous importance. It is imperative for children to develop and grow into mature, decision-making adults for the health of our society and communities. The violence and delinquency we see in juveniles today poses the question of what causes them to commit these atrocities. This kind of crime has created an issue imperative to juvenile health, as the country currently arrests and detains more juveniles than any other country in the world, arresting 424,300 total juveniles in 2020, and in 2019, juveniles were involved in 1 out of 11 violent crimes in the United States. These statistics may sound bleak. However, in my thesis, I aim to dissect this issue, and I will show you how recommendations can be implemented to make this issue better. First, I want to highlight specifically why it is so important. It affects a much larger array than people might originally consider. Of course, it affects the victims of crime and most in their immediate vicinity, especially when it comes to violent crime. This can leave effects of trauma, PTSD, depression and anxiety, and this can also manifest in other forms of aggression as well, or social isolation. Even regarding more simple delinquent acts, people are left with a sense of uneasiness and unsafe in their own community. On the other end, as well as a victim, there is also a perpetrator. When it comes to crime and delinquency, perpetrators are often victims as well as perpetrators. They are typically suffering in their own lives. 42% of juvenile offenders have been victims of violent crimes themselves, and it is frequently a perpetuated cycle of violence that continues criminal activity in adolescence. Unfortunately, after juveniles are prosecuted for their acts, they tend to face lives that are either worse than the one they were facing or just as bad when they're in prison. When they're incarcerated or detained, any support system that they may have had is completely stripped away from them. And almost 100% of youth in detention have a diagnosable mental disorder, and a large population of imprisoned or detained youth are not able to get the help that they need to help their mental health. A large population also lack or have extremely subpar education, all of which continue to bring youth down instead of actually fix their issues. The fact that many juveniles may not have proper access to mental health or education services while in detainment is a fact that should alarm the American population. Lastly, for perpetrators, prison and detainment have also been repeatedly proven to only increase recidivism rates. Recidivism is the tendency or likelihood of a criminal to reoffend, and the rate for juveniles is exponentially increased when youth do not get the help that they need. In America, within 3 years of release, 75% of juvenile offenders are back in prison. As well as both the victim and the perpetrator, society itself suffers greatly from this issue of juvenile crime. This graph demonstrates the investment that it takes to incarcerate a youth for 12 months and the investment that it takes to invest in community building activities or education that would prevent that juvenile from ever going down the path of delinquency in the first place, which turns out to be cheaper and a better economic investment. Even though the incarceration rate of youth has overall decreased, state spending on this issue has not. And on average, states spend $5 billion a year incarcerating juveniles. This money could instead be used to build a stronger community that would prevent juveniles from ever going down the path of criminal activity. One of the first steps to be taken concerning this issue is to focus on exactly what is causing adolescents to become delinquents or criminals. Any factor that a youth can possess that makes them more likely to commit a crime or commit a delinquent act is known as a risk factor. A child that is 10 years old and exposed to 6 or more risk factors before they turn 18 is 10 times more likely to act out violently than a child only exposed to 1 risk factor. However, it is important to assume that solely because a child was exposed to a multitude of risk factors that they will not act out violently, because a lot of children are faced with these kind of risk factors and never manifest them violently. Some of the more common risk factors that juvenile delinquents experience include exposure to traumatic situations, or a multitude of them, repeated violence, violations, sexual, physical, or otherwise, exploitation, negative influences, and rejection or abandonment. Several also face poor family situations and unstable parenting. According to the Northwestern Juvenile Project, 92.5% of detained youths report experiencing at least one traumatic event, and 84% reported experiencing more than one. This kind of trauma can diminish the sense of future that any juvenile might have and make them feel as if criminal activity is their only way out of life, or to go about life. After discussing the common causes of crime, the comparisons between gender, race, and socioeconomic status are very important to consider. To begin, the most commonly studied difference is between male and female offending. Gendered pathways can explain these differences, as girls often experience a much more different pathway than boys throughout the justice system. A large portion of female crime is attributed to one or more mental health disorders, and they're also more likely to struggle with these mental health disorders as a subsequent result of their criminal activity. Data repeatedly exhibits the fact that many girls in the justice system have experienced some form of sexual victimization and trauma, and in the study of delinquent offenders, it was found that only 3% of male offenders were exposed to sexual victimization, as opposed to a staggering 77% of female offenders. A 2010 survey of 7,000 incarcerated youth nationwide also found that females were twice as likely to have reported experiencing prior physical abuse than males. This differs from male delinquency, as it is more common for male delinquents to manifest their anger and aggression, and that is what causes them to become criminals. Differences in male and female criminal activity also inspires differences in their prosecution. Generally, the range of acceptable behavior for females is much different than that of males. It is not uncommon for females to receive much longer and/or harsher punishments for the same or similar acts than their male counterparts, and inside facilities that they are placed in, females have been found less likely to receive medications and are more likely to receive less time hospitalized for the same reasons. These situations can be attributed to the lack of understanding and research allocated to female offending. Second to gender is racial analysis. Historically, research concerning the racial analysis of crime in the United States has tended to focus solely on both Black and Caucasian Americans, which has led to a current deficit in our knowledge of the offending tendencies of other minorities. Therefore, for the purpose of my thesis, mostly only the differences between Black and Caucasian crime rates were researched. Black Americans historically have been and are currently overrepresented in the adult and juvenile justice systems, and while almost all theories explaining this are controversial, there are two main processes which the majority of researchers can agree on: differential enforcement and differential offending. Differential enforcement begins with the decision to place more police presence in areas that are largely populated by people of color, and they're strategically placed in the areas with the highest level of crime rates, which are often places that are economically disadvantaged and often, unfortunately, disproportionately populated by minorities. So it naturally occurs that they will come into contact with police officers at a much higher rate. Second is differential offending. Research widely accepts that minorities tend to be faced with much higher levels of risk factors than other Americans, and those are strongly associated with acting out in delinquency and crime. And these include disadvantaged residents, compromised family situations, education and employment difficulties, and more. Differential offending simply says that because minorities often come into contact with risk factors more often, they are more likely to offend. One of the most well-documented and important indicators of juvenile delinquency and crime is the socioeconomic status of an individual or their family. The concept of strains, as I mentioned before, confirms that youth growing up in poverty are confronted with many different and much higher levels of risk factors than youth who can grow up in a higher socioeconomic status family will have to experience. Low SES families are more likely to reside in less affluent areas and more unstable parts of towns, which facilitate more offending opportunities than more stable parts of town. Youth dealing with low SES may have parents that are not fully aware of their actions or under much higher levels of stress because they're worried about their income. This will allow juveniles to have less supervision and more time to get involved with crime. CPS and child welfare systems are also much more likely to serve families of lower income. Youth in group homes are twice as likely to commit delinquent acts as youth who are in-home placements or going through community-based services and programs. Youth involved in both the CPS and court systems are known as crossover youth, and often the CPS and child welfare system will close the door on crossover youth, leaving them to have nowhere but the court system to turn to. Low SES parents of juvenile delinquents often will turn their kids over to the court as well because they cannot afford other services to take care of their child. Following the same pattern as gender and race, differences in the committing of crime or delinquency due to low SES is accompanied by differences in prosecuting. In juvenile court petitions concerning adolescents who are truly in need of prosecution can actually be filed. This can lead to a disproportionate amount of lower income children experiencing the judicial process because families with higher SES can usually afford services that will handle their child for them instead of having to give them over to the court system and filing a court petition. Jurisdictions across the nation differ on their court codes and policies, and some of them have requirements that make life much harder for lower SES families to comply with. For example, some jurisdictions require that if a child's parents cannot be easily and readily contacted for an interview, that child immediately qualifies for diversion or immediate detention. Most juvenile codes also require that a juvenile cannot be released from detention unless their parent is stable and can take care of them, leading to a disproportionate amount of low SES children to be facing the court system in detention more often. The delinquency and crime issues across the country must be addressed. In my thesis, I explore solutions that can and should be implemented before, during, and after incarceration. It is important that policy recommendations in the United States begin to focus on preventative measures as opposed to only treatment. For the purpose of my thesis, I will only be able to discuss a small amount of policy recommendations that I actually researched for my thesis. Early intervention is one of the best ways to prevent delinquency and crime before they ever manifest in a child. Intervention programs can begin as early as preschool, and there have been several successful models that follow just this philosophy. These programs often result in higher levels of school readiness, social functioning, and communication skills, all of which are associated with a lower likelihood to offend. Educational facilities should foster environments where children are protected from risk factors and can develop self-esteem, which can be accomplished through reformative programs. One model program for early intervention is called LIFT, otherwise known as Linking the Interests of Families and Teachers. Focusing on elementary school kids, the goal of the program targeted children who lived in at-risk neighborhoods and exhibited at-risk behaviors, and it was based on 3 essential components: classroom-based social skills training, the playground good behavior game, and parent management training. A LIFT line was implemented in every classroom that parents were encouraged to call if they had questions about what their child would be participating in school that day, and teachers could call parents if their child was exhibiting any behaviors that they wanted to be notified about. This facilitated incredibly strong communication between families and teachers. LIFT was an incredibly successful program, and children who participated in LIFT exhibited fewer aversive behaviors each day than those in the control group. At the 3-year follow-up, LIFT children had less affiliation with misbehaving peers and were less likely to engage in alcohol and drug usage. At the 7-year follow-up, LIFT youth also had a reduced risk of alcohol and drug usage. Overall, it was able to make a positive impact in the families with at-risk kids and showed that risk factors can be overcome through early intervention programs. Another crucial step in preventing delinquency is to provide youth with ample opportunities. The more opportunities a youth has to become involved in something that is positive for their community, the less likely they are to get involved with crime. Truancy, or when youth stay away from school without good reason, losing vital education, is one of the leading causes of juvenile criminal activity. People often like to think that this doesn't happen in their own community, but here in Little Rock, 14% of youth are chronically absent, just below the national average of 16%. Portland, Oregon implemented a program called the Self-Enhancement Incorporated, or the SEI program, which currently sponsors field trips, sporting events, after-school supervision, encourages classroom instruction and excellence in schools, and is run through fundraising. Students in the SEI program in elementary school raised their grades by 47%, and students participating in the SEI program in high school or in middle school were able to raise it by 70%. This approach to reducing truancy has had positive effects for not only juveniles, but also their communities. Mentoring is another simple yet incredibly valuable and effective strategy for encouraging positive development in youth. Bigs in Blue is a mentoring program established in Warren County, New Jersey. And the mentors it matched at-risk youth with police officer mentors, and the mentors were able to employ intervention strategies to help juveniles in negative environments be able to face peer pressure. Evaluations of the program showed that involved youth had reductions in delinquency and court involvement, as well as less court petitions filed against them. If adolescents know that they have a support and advocacy system, they are more likely to remain on the right path. Service programs are also incredibly beneficial in not only preventing delinquency, but also benefiting the community. Through the Learn and Serve America program, school youth could serve their communities by educating younger students about violence prevention and peer pressure. This program allowed youth to learn vital skills and develop healthy behaviors while also benefiting their community. Even though preventative measures are some of the more important ones that need to be focused on, juvenile incarceration and detention is inevitable. So it is imperative that we discuss the reforms that need to be taken against this or in this system. Research continues to prove that the current methods of detention and incarceration for juveniles are almost entirely ineffective. A 2010 meta-analysis of studies conducted over 29 different studies concerning formal juvenile court processing determined that juvenile processing almost always increased criminal behavior, especially when compared with community-based programs. Also in 2010, it was estimated that fewer than 5% of high-risk juvenile offenders were actually being treated with evidence-based treatments, meaning that over 95% of incarcerated youth are being treated with programs that are not actually proven to be effective in reducing their recidivism likelihood. Juvenile facilities face the issue of not having proper resources or programs devoted to their juveniles. The National Commission on Correctional Health Care, or the NCCHC, has published the standards of care that juvenile facilities should be operating under. However, this list of standards is seemingly pointless because accreditation is not formally required for juvenile justice facilities to run for the NCCHC. Only a very small portion of facilities across the country actually can check off everything on this list and actually meet these standards, despite thousands actually being in operation. In every state, accreditation should absolutely be required for these facilities to run and operate, and juveniles should be receiving adequate mental health treatment at every step of the juvenile justice process with no exceptions. Mandatory mental health screening should be implemented, and subsequent therapy and treatment should also be implemented in every one of these facilities. The importance of education while in detention or incarceration cannot be overstated. This graph from 2016 shows the population of juveniles who have adequate access to courses they need to obtain a GED or diploma, and there's no reason that 100% of juveniles should not have access to all of the courses that they need to graduate high school. Properly educating criminal youth is one of the most effective ways to reduce recidivism rates. As the Department of Justice reports that within a year of release, 55% of juvenile offenders will be back in prison. But with education, this number significantly drops. The median age of youth in juvenile detention centers is 15 years old, and the average reading level is 4th grade. This is an issue that needs to be solved immediately. All of these things, juvenile justice facilities need instructional time, teachers equipped to handle any kind of student, and adequate school resources. It is imperative to the health of our society that the above recommendations be taken into account and implemented across the country. Not only is the prevention and rehabilitation of juveniles beneficial, but it is also incredibly cost-effective to the country. Most prevention programs would offset the total cost of incarcerating juveniles, saving the country money in the end. In 2013, a RAND Corporation study found that the U.S. saves about $2 million for each juvenile that is successfully rehabilitated during their time in incarceration or detention. Citizen tax dollars can be diverted to these kinds of programs, and eventually they will no longer have to be spent on juvenile incarceration. They can be simply spent on juvenile protection. To close, the worldview of delinquents has to change. The mindset of the country must be switched from punishment to rehabilitation and treatment. Investing in our youth is in everyone's best interest, and by continuing to take steps forward, we can achieve these goals. Thank you.
What role does or should the private sector play in this? A lot of your data is talking about government programs, government funding. Are there private sector programs or private funding, whether that be through community organizations, churches? How does that play into this narrative?
Like private prisons or private?
I was talking about even programs that are privately run and not necessarily under the umbrella of the government.
I think programs that are privately run could play an extremely valuable role in the rehabilitation of juveniles because, like you said, churches and other kinds of things that can kind of offer these programs that it's not hard for youth to get involved in. Like if Jenny Church is here, we're running after-school programs, after-school care for youth would be incredibly beneficial for them to get involved in. And any kind of service program that kind of private institutions can run in the community can be incredibly helpful in decreasing the juvenile crime rate.
What about a little bit more on family dynamic? Single parent households, could you hit on that variable at all?
Yes.
I mean, is that something I think that plays into the narrative so significantly?
I wasn't able to include it in my defense, but there was a good section of my thesis devoted to the broken home theory, which states that juveniles in single parent households or facing very unstable parenting or lack of supervision are exponentially more likely to get involved in juvenile crime and delinquency because they have either if you're a child growing up without a father or a child growing up without a mother, you lack a significant, important influence in your life to kind of show you how to live the correct way. And even you might have both of your parents, but one of them could be abusive or leading by bad example. And that's a broken home as well and can also kind of influence the juveniles to act out badly.
Great job, Molly. Fun to read, and we talked a lot about how it was kind of a luck of a situation, which family you're born into.
Absolutely.
So I love that you always kind of recognize that too. You said that like the community-led programs seem to be, the most helpful because of course that's our environment. So if it's the community-led but then you have the state and then the federal, but then you also said that a lot of these programs are ineffective and not do well, regardless of if they have accreditation. So who ultimately decides, like, is it that community that decides it or the state level, without even going into funding? I'm just curious, because we know the poorer areas, you have fewer resources. So while we say we want you to have community, I mean, they don't have it. Is there a moment the state helps, or is it more federal helping?
Honestly, I wasn't able to get too much into that kind of area, but if I had more time, I would have liked to go there. But
It's just no clear path.
there just is no clear path. I mean, unfortunately, if you are born into a family of low socioeconomic status or you're living in an area that's less affluent, you just aren't going to have the access to these resources that everyone, unfortunately, should have access to, but sometimes it just occurs that you don't have access to it, and that's just kind of a thing that is almost unavoidable.
So it's like you're relying just on how good your local community is before you can even get to the state help. And then in your last chapter, you talked a lot, there were like these 8 different groups that you hit upon some of just these programs that are doing well. That city planner one made me laugh because my mother's a city planner. So I think it was about 8 you looked into. If you had like the Molly Williams plan, like an hors d'oeuvre platter of what you were grabbing from each thing, so which elements do you find most helpful?
I think the early intervention elements are by far the most important in my opinion. The program like LIFT that I talked about, I think any school that can implement that should absolutely implement that. I mean, Toppich knows last year in international studies, we did a lot of research into how effective early intervention is in the lives of juveniles, even just for reading capability and things like just literacy. If schools can implement early intervention programs, they should absolutely do that as best they can. And I think that any sort of, like Toppich was saying, church after school programs or any place that can provide youth with time that is spent under supervision or doing beneficial good things is going to be the best way to prevent them from like ever even thinking about committing acts of delinquency or criminal activity.
Great, thank you.
My first question was kind of related to that. Actually, it's almost exactly related to that. I was going to ask if it were up to you, completely up to you, you're making laws, you're making decisions, where would you go first? What's the first thing that you would do?
If I was making laws, I would, I'd probably focus on education and mental health in juvenile incarceration and detention centers. Because, I mean, when I was researching, the statistics that I was reading about mental health and education in those facilities was heartbreaking and shocking to me. The amount of juveniles that are faced with a lack of or extremely subpar education or no one to turn to help with their mental health disorders would have been the first place I would look. I would implement healthcare professionals in all these facilities and make sure, I know plenty of them have them implemented, but a lot of facilities, juveniles inside of those don't have good access to those professionals every day. A statistic I didn't get to include was I think about only 49% of juveniles actually have good access to mental health professionals every day in detention centers. And that would probably be the first place I look to if I was able to do whatever I wanted for this issue.
My second question is, what was your favorite part of doing this? What will you take with you from here, like to college?
My favorite part of doing this was realizing that things that I was researching don't have to be boring. They can actually matter to me, and things that I'm researching can have a positive impact. And for once, I finally felt like I was working on a project that really mattered to me. And I will carry that with me for the rest of my life. And it inspires me to know, okay, I can research things that really matter to me, and I can actually make a difference with them. Definitely.
Thank you. You did a great job.
Well, you did an excellent job on that. I know you struggled in the beginning trying to figure out which direction you wanted to go, and I think you nailed it, and you did such a great job. So in your research, I mean, let's just focus here in Arkansas. I know that we are on the rise with juvenile crime here, and I know there's a mentor program with the police. You know, you have Officer Norman in Little Rock that does a lot of work. So what else did you find that our community, either in Pulaski County or in Arkansas, that we're doing to help? Yes.
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to devote a lot of time to studying just kind of our community, like Little Rock and Arkansas, but I do know that we struggle a lot here with a lot of families are unfortunately facing low socioeconomic status, and they're not able to give their children the resources that are necessary to be able to prevent them from getting involved in delinquency. And it's just unfortunate that Arkansas, here in our own community, we're faced a lot with this. And we actually do have a lot of juveniles that aren't getting proper education. Like I said, our truancy rate is right on par with the national average, but I wasn't able to focus really on the Arkansas, kind of what our community is doing to combat this issue. But if I could have, I absolutely would love to do that, maybe in a future project.
There you go.
Good job.
Well, a fantastic job. Thank you. How important is the role of teachers and counselors in school in helping to identify students that have multiple risk factors?
I think it's arguably probably the most important role in a juvenile's life other than their own family would be teachers and counselors, and people who are spending the most time with them directly outside of family would be those people. And if teachers can identify children who exhibit at-risk behaviors almost every day, and we're able to help them in any way that they can, I think that would genuinely help this issue almost more than anything other than just families and withdrawal, how you're born. But
So if one of the biggest contributing factors is low socioeconomic status, it seems to me that, the system in particular neighborhoods or in particular regions would be overwhelmed
Mhm.
with large numbers of at-risk populations. How do you bridge that gap then between wealthier communities and low-income communities to help provide support in that way?
I think if we were able to establish a good amount of, if we were able to show the wealthier communities, hey, this is what these people are facing, this is the kind of issues that we need to combat in our community, and we were able to kind of bridge some sympathy between both communities, I think that would kind of inspire the wealthier communities to devote any time that they can, or if they could start any sort of programs, like any wealthier churches or wealthier schools could start any kind of programs that can really focus on youth who are of a family of a lower socioeconomic status or just live in a less affluent area. I think if we just kind of can bridge that gap by building sympathy and kind of inspiring them to devote more time and effort to that, I think that would be a beneficial thing.
Would you recommend maybe Pulaski Academy doing outreach programs to?
I would recommend Pulaski Academy doing outreach programs to less affluent schools or schools with lower socioeconomic youth.
Tell us a little bit about opportunities that you had for interviews, maybe missed opportunities if you were redoing the project and it was August, 12th again.
I was redoing the project. Well, first I had an incredibly inspiring conversation with Judge Wendell Griffin about, he really kind of showed me, okay, this is what this issue looks like in our community in Little Rock. It's so important. We have here we kind of already discussed it. We have a disproportionate amount of people who face low socioeconomic status, and we have a huge youth delinquency problem here. He kind of showed me that, and he was able to really kind of sort of ignite me in the path that led me to kind of want to reform my project. So he was without a doubt one of the most beneficial interviews that I had, but I can't really think of any missed opportunities for interviews. If I could have implemented them more into my project, I would have liked to do that better. That would probably be one of my
Social service areas,
yes,
some of the
I would
people
have
that work
liked
in
to.
it is difficult though when you're talking about juveniles because it's,
Yes,
there's a lot more.
The law
issues
protects juveniles, and I wasn't really able to kind of
legality
crack into
issues
that
and
in Little
such.
Rock.
I guess we'll open it up to the audience. This is a really astute group.
Maestro Hagerman.
So congrats, you're done. But how are you going to take what you learned and apply it to your future?
Well, I actually do want to go to law school, and if I can, I would love to be able to focus on juvenile law whenever I graduate college and graduate law school. This is hopefully the start of the rest of my life to me. Lauren?
I know due to time limits, you weren't able to include your case studies, and so I'm wondering which case study did you find most shocking or most vital in your writing of your thesis?
That's a good question. Probably I was going to include 2 case studies, but when I ran through, I was at 25 minutes and I couldn't talk about them. But honestly, the nonviolent case studies that I studied were more important to me, and they really resonated with me more. There was one about an 11-year-old boy in North Carolina who shoplifted from Macy's and then got just completely bogged down within the juvenile court process because he was sentenced to probation and was fined and had community service to do. And he completed all of his community service, but his family, due to being having almost no income, wasn't able to pay his fines. And that placed him on level 2 probation when he went back to the court 12 months later for evaluation, which made him one step closer to qualifying for diversion or detention. And that just really hurt me because it's just not fair for children of low SESUs. If they're not able to pay this, then the court should know that and maybe figure out a different way to evaluate that. But that would be my most beneficial case study to me. Charlotte?
I know you included how important societal views of these juveniles has impacted them. And so how do we generate buy-in from these juveniles who've been mistreated and have possibly created distrust or lost faith in the system?
Yes. So this was actually something I studied called the looking glass self theory, which is where if a juvenile has, it's the same thing our teachers always say, you cheat once, you establish yourself as a cheater, no other teacher's going to view you as anything else. That's kind of how it is for juvenile delinquents. If they commit a delinquent act or they were a convicted criminal, it's really hard for them to be seen as anything else. So if we were to make them feel like they have all the opportunities in the world to change themselves, and be better, that would truly, like, that would ignite something within them and make them feel as if they were able to overcome their past, and really if we make them feel like they can make a difference in their community and they're not defined by their past, they are way more likely to change their juvenile delinquency offending patterns. Anna?
So I have two questions.
Yeah.
And my first is kind of just a clarification question.
Mhm.
Did you, in your case study, study juveniles as people under the age of 18 specifically?
Yes.
Or, okay. And then my second question is, I know Top has talked about like private programs, but did you find any differences in private prisons versus government-owned prisons and how they treated juvenile delinquents?
Well, I wasn't able to kind of research that for my thesis, but I have, for previous projects, looked into the privatization of prisons and how that is probably not a good thing for the juvenile reform issue. But unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of time to research that, but I wish I could.
Anyway, I thought you were gonna get out of here.
I did.
I do have more of a comment than anything. I think that based on the data that you gave, it's the early intervention,
Absolutely.
because once the train leaves the station, it's hard to
It is.
get it back. It's hard to mold the mind of a 13-year-old who's been in and out of the system than a 4-year-old.
Absolutely. It's imperative that we do that. I mean, it's like you always say, it's always harder to like break a habit than just not ever create the habit. And that's kind of the same philosophy.
And if you can ever find a way to bridge the, did I interrupt you?
No, I mean, yeah, but no.
If you ever find a way to get the buy-in from the community, from those that have,
Mhm.
to help the have-nots and the haves to get out of just focusing on their own lives and to help others,
Mhm.
you will change the world. So
You will.
So was there a particular city, community that you read about in your thesis or covered that was really doing it well?
Not a particular community, but the SCI program that I talked about in Portland, Oregon was, if things like that can be implemented here and in other communities, that would be incredibly beneficial to all of our youth. If we had something like that in Little Rock, where like through fundraising, things were being sponsored for juveniles to spend time benefiting the community instead of getting involved in delinquency, I think that would exponentially help our problem here.
Great job.
Wait.
Oh,
my gosh.
Yeah, everyone.
I don't want to keep you busy.
Yeah,
Fantastic
yeah.
topic and well, just congratulations.
Thank you.
Great work. But I do have a question. So what about, it seems like it's a multifaceted issue. I mean, you've got the children, and so if you
Very
just take
much.
the children, you can't just take the children away from their
Yes.
families that are
Are not
involved
influencing
in
them.
this. And so how do you also create supports? It seems to me like those families also need those supports.
Mhm. I actually was able to talk about in my thesis, I wasn't able to talk about it in my defense, but there were programs in my policy recommendations factor of FFT, which is functional family therapy, and which is the kind of thing that families, if they're struggling, they can go to, and it will kind of help the parents facilitate better communication with their kids and teach them better parenting ways. And that was something I didn't get to talk about, but it was included in my thesis. And I think if we had something like that, like functional family therapy in those kind of areas where families aren't able to have good connections, it could also help.
And are you familiar with Our House?
I think I saw it in my research for sure.
I think if that could just be magnified.
Absolutely.
We
Absolutely.
had some kids volunteer there over the
Yeah,
years.
it's a fantastic program, all that.
Good one.
Committee members, come on up. Family is second. Let's go back to your first slide.
Oh, okay.
Go back to your intro slide. And then,
Looking past the black and the gray, and then she has that beautiful blue one. We'll put her in the middle. I'm jealous. Next Monday.
good job. You went a little fast a couple times.
Yeah, I do have a few
It's fine, it's only me.
We want to get the slide. So remember, 2 and 2. Yeah, is this good?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, ready?
I have something for the
Yeah,
community.
you can be there. You gotta be there.
Thank y'all.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's a pretty good. I'm gonna say fashion-wise, that's
I'm so that's so relieved.
yeah. Oh my God.
Okay,
I don't really that way. I'm really invincible right now.
Get one.
I'm 30. I already have one. I don't want to know. But
Okay, let's family.
Not a lot of edits. The girl has her grammar and now they're I was just like, yes, this is sad. Boo. I was like, I want you to know I'm
Okay,
wrong.
Mom and Dad.
She always likes to stab me. I was like, oh, I know. You know, like, just like, oh, my mom was getting better. I did. I was like, oh, what's mom's up? Because if you go to the paragraph, I'm not writing. We're not reading. So, oh, I know you're reading. I just was like, boo. Okay, ready? We'll do 1, 2, 3. Articles about volcanoes. 1, 2, 3. Choose from.
Yeah, family pick. Oh yeah, go back to the.
How did that happen? Mom, what'd you do?
Don't blame Mom.
Oh, I'm going back the other way. I was like, I was looking at us. I was gonna say, I look like that.
No, keep them together on one side, right side. I think it's without the sun being.
I know he has.
Is that it? You got new ones?
Yes, yes.
All right. All right. Thank you, everyone, by the way. Ready? I'll come up in a couple hours. Got a little faster once or twice. You got some first meeting.
Library flowers. You don't get to leave flowers. Thank you. Very classy. Yeah.
So far, it's been
Thank you so much for being here.
I think maybe. I think violation. I had it learning it beforehand. No, I had it learning for an hour. Okay.
Well.
No, it was. We had it on the entire last time. Yeah, middle school. My ninth grade was.
Well, no, but we very early on, it was just that. I knew we were correct with